Hello, everyone. Delighted that you're all here. My name is John Efron. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at UC Berkeley. So wherever you are watching from, whether it's morning or afternoon or evening, we're delighted to have you here. We have this semester, just by way of introduction, I just want to say that this semester we have a number of very exciting talks, the first of which you're going to hear in a few minutes by Dina Danon. We're extremely excited to kick off this sort of semester's series of talks with a talk on Sephardic Jewish history. At the other end of the spectrum, on March 4th, I want to bring your attention to what will be a rather extraordinary presentation by Arun Viswanat, who has translated Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone into Yiddish, which has been reviewed everywhere in the New York Times, everything. It's a tremendous achievement to have been able to translate the book into Yiddish. And so that's on March 4th at the same time at 4 o'clock. So I want to draw that to your attention. And then April 8th, actually, we're going to be having a talk by Michael Brenner, who will be speaking, who's this year's Pell lecturer, and he's going to be speaking on Hitler's laboratory, how Munich became the capital of anti-Semitism after World War I. And there's been a lot of comparisons of late between the Weimar Republic and, of course, contemporary situation in the United States. And Michael Brenner has written on that as well and spoken on that. And this book is the product of research on the sort of the last phase of democracy in the Weimar Republic and then the tragedy that befell it afterwards. But that's for later. So go to our website, jewishstudies.berkeley.edu, for more details. But what I want to do now is turn it over to my colleague, Karen Barkey. Karen is the Haas Distinguished Chair of Religious Diversity at the Othering and Belonging Institute, and also a professor in the Department of Sociology, where she works. She's a historical sociologist and works on the interactions between three faiths, certainly in the Ottoman Empire and beyond. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her, and she is going to welcome Dina. So thank you. Take it away, Karen.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this first event of the semester at the Center for Jewish Studies. I'm really excited to introduce and happy to introduce Dina Danon, who is an associate professor of Judaic studies at Binghamton State University and the interim director of MENA, the Middle East and North African Studies program. Professor Danon focuses on the Eastern Sephardi diaspora during modern times and is interested in the particular trajectories of the Sephardi world towards modernity. Her work draws on previously unexplored Ladino language, archival material, Ladino newspapers, and the discourse of community members. Danon is particularly interested in social history and questions of class and poverty in the trajectory to modernity. The book she will discuss today was published by Stanford University Press in 2020 and is titled The Jews of Ottoman Izmir, A Modern History. Her second project is on matchmaking, marriage, and divorce in the Ottoman Sephardic world. I am really looking forward to this book. Reading about poverty is one thing, but matchmaking and community marriage markets might even make a movie one day. So I am excited. And I'm so happy to welcome Dina here at CJS. We have actually, you wouldn't know, but we have so many connections. My father was born in Izmir and was schooled in the Alliance system. So half my family is Izmirli. And I had a very different version, I have to say, of Izmir from my paternal grandmother. And Dina's Stanford advisor, Aaron Rodriguez, is a long, long time friend, colleague, everything from Istanbul. So the fact that you worked with Aaron is an extra topping, you know, on the fact that you work on Izmir. And it's really wonderful to welcome you. So the way we'll do this is we'll give you 35, 40 minutes to present. I'll ask a couple of questions and put it maybe through my lens into a context. And then we'll open it to the floor, but in this Zoom world we live in, I am gonna read questions, I guess, and ask them and read them for you. And I might choose a few, and we promise not to tire you a lot, but welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I will try to share my screen. Can you see those slides okay? Okay, wonderful. Yes. Okay. In 1899, the Jewish community of Ottoman Izmir came to a near standstill. The death of Chief Rabbi Abraham Palachi in January of that year had led to the first transfer of rabbinic power in over 30 years. The ensuing turmoil over the appointment of a successor, as well as a range of problems that had long plagued the communal administration, now bitterly polarized the community. Most contentious was management of the local kosher meat industry, which, through the levy of a regressive sales tax known as the gabela, generated the overwhelming majority of the community's revenue. Warring fractions advanced competing visions of how a new chief rabbi might improve the system, lessening its inefficiencies and distributing its burden more equitably. In the spring, La Buena Esperanza, then Izmir's longest running Ladino periodical, published a fictional dialogue between Simon and Reuben, distilling the arguments circulating in the community regarding the payment of shochatim, or ritual slaughterers. While Simon remained skeptical about changing the traditional system, Reuben insisted that the shochatim had monopolized communal coffers for too long. They engaged in a protracted debate. Simon: but that goes against the religious rulings. Reuben: I beg you, enough. The rulings were made in other times. Now our public is poor. If it can't support itself, should it die to help others? Simon: is this something new? There have always been shochatim. We never complained. What has now changed that we should pick a fight with these good people? Reuben: it's true that this evil is quite old. If we pick a fight with them now, it's because of how things have spun out of control. What would you prefer? That they exploit the people, cost us more than 100,000 kurush a year, cause conflicts, and as they say, ignite the community? Until now, we tolerated it, but we no longer want anything to do with them. Reuben's position pivots on a keen awareness of a changed socioeconomic reality. While the Jews of Ottoman Izmir had prospered in the city's early modern period, playing an essential role in its emergence as a major port in the 17th century, by the 19th century, a constellation of global and local factors had combined to destabilize their position. By the time La Buena Esperanza published Reuben and Simon's dialogue in 1899, the Jews of Izmir were no longer the customs agents, tax farmers, and translators they had once been, but rather greengrocers, tailors, peddlers, and beggars. So dramatic had their downfall been that in the late 19th century, nearly 1/3 of the Jewish community in Izmir reportedly subsisted solely on charity. Yet, as my new book argues, about Reuben's Jewish poverty was not its prevalence, nor its exacerbation in the 19th century, but rather its position in a larger rupture between agora, or and now, or otros tiempos, and other times. Reuben's understanding of agora and its ability to necessitate new solutions to old problems, such as that of the kosher meat industry, was undergirded by numerous assumptions. For Rubin, Izmir's Jewish poor constituted a collectivity that might intervene in communal affairs and advocate for itself. This collectivity represented its interests through the vehicle of el público, the public, which might not only check abuses, but mount a lasting challenge to traditional religious authority. Moreover, Rubin's palpable indignation suggests that the Agora of 1899 had ultimately compelled a reconsideration of poverty itself, betraying a sense that its unchecked persistence and expansion was not only undesirable, but fundamentally unacceptable. It's Rubin's understanding of how the modern age had reordered such social hierarchies that animates my book's central interpretive claim. By 1899, the impoverishment of Izmir's Jewish community had come to stand painfully at odds with modern attitudes that had recategorized poverty as a social ill, as well as the triumph of local triumph of middle-class values. It's this disjuncture, this rupture with a centuries-old worldview that casts poverty as a natural, acceptable, and even stabilizing force in society that propelled Izmir's Jews to engage in a series of modern initiatives. And while communal leaders typically denounce the community's socioeconomic decline as a source of weakness and decay, my book demonstrates the reverse, capturing how the growing empowerment and self-awareness of Izmir's poor and lower classes catalyzed a dynamic reimagining of the kehillah, or the semi-autonomous communal structure, and its varied institutions. Underlying all of these transformations was the evolution of a robust Ladino public sphere, in which the needs of el pueblo, the people, were constantly debated with recourse to an expanding vocabulary of rights. Yet, even more important than shedding light on an overlooked Eastern Sephardi community are the ways in which Izmir, as a case study, invites a reconsideration of assumptions that have long governed the study of modern Jewish history. Prevailing conceptual paradigms such as assimilation, acculturation, integration, secularization, among many others, are largely the intellectual legacy of reflection on the Jewish experience in various Ashkenazi contexts. While European communities differed in many respects, across nation states and empires alike, Jews in Europe were often confronted with the notion that their religious and cultural distinctiveness was somehow incompatible with the modern age. From the absolutist Russian Empire to the German nation state to the secular French Republic, European Jews had to contend in some way with the homogenizing pressure resulting from a relentless tension between the universal and the particular, a tension that they negotiated in countless ways. But the view from Ottoman Izmir reveals these categories to be of little interpretive value. While never static, the prevailing social hierarchy refracted through the typically flexible Ottoman interpretation of Sharia law, coupled with the profound ethnic and religious diversity characterizing the empire itself, cultivated a social fabric that was not only tolerant of difference, but predicated upon it. The legitimation of religious and ethnic distinctiveness persisted in the 19th century, despite and sometimes even in concert with efforts to promote other forms of shared belonging, such as the Ottomanism of the Tanzimat reform era or the constitutional fervor of the Young Turks. This continued affirmation was notably the case for Sephardi Jews as opposed to their Greek and Armenian neighbors, as their position in the Ottoman landscape was not complicated by the rising tide of various nationalisms. For the long arc of Ottoman history, the legitimacy of Jewish difference was simply not in question. As I argue in my book, the Ottoman landscape then requires a different set of questions. What happens when Jewish distinctiveness is wholly unremarkable? What happens when Jewish communal autonomy is not only tolerated, but affirmed, amplified, even cast as a necessary precondition for the modern age? What types of change might we anticipate when there is no Jewish question? Following Izmir's Jews on the street and in the marketplace, in the home and the synagogue, the view from late Ottoman Izmir suggests that it was new attitudes to poverty and class, not Judaism, that most significantly influenced this Sephardi community's encounter with the modern age. Interestingly, Purim celebrations constitute a useful point of departure in this regard. Nowhere in Turkey or Bulgaria is the festival of Purim celebrated with as much noise, bustle, and animation as it is here, remarked one observer in 1891, detailing a boisterous street scene of lights, brass bands, myrtle branches, lamps of multicolored Venetian glass, costumed revelers, and drunkards. Despite such enthusiasm, the sources reveal that Purim was a perennial source of anxiety for Izmir's Jewish leaders. Rabbis, lay leaders, and journalists alike vehemently denounced the festivities, frequently urging the Ottoman authorities to ban them. Although carnivals were a major source of preoccupation, particularly vexing was the local custom of distributing charity to a large procession of beggars through the streets, lasting from morning until nightfall. And these are the records of the communal leaders fretting about these processions. The anxiety leaders expressed about the procession is rooted in the dramatic changes the city itself witnessed in the modern period. Along with the reconfiguration of Ottoman administrative practices, legal systems, and commercial codes as a result of the Tanzimat reform movement, also came a transformation of urban space. Like other Ottoman cities, Izmir became a laboratory for the implementation of a Western approach that prized order, rationality, cleanliness, and the safeguarding of the public good. New rail and streetcar lines, public utilities, new docks, customs houses, and a seaside pedestrian promenade called the Cordon dramatically changed the city's built environment. A significantly expanded volume of trade made the city a hub for foreign merchants, who now comprised 1/4 of its total population. New cafes, restaurants, hotels, and department stores abounded in what travelers called Le Petit Paris de l'Orient, the little Paris of the Orient, while its non-Muslim majority led the city to be labeled Gavur Izmir, infidel Smyrna in the eyes of Turks. Izmir's Jewish leadership demonstrated a keen awareness of the changes taking place in the city. The local Jewish press abounds with articles chronicling Izmir's transformation into a modern municipality, with copious reports lauding efforts of local authorities to stem epidemics, prevent crime, improve the city's cleanliness and hygienic conditions, and safeguard the public peace. Sephardi newspaper editors constantly reinforced the notion of a partnership between the municipality and its residents, urging their readers to take an active role in transforming the city into a well-ordered and clean modern space. Yet such a partnership was complicated for Izmir's Jewish community. Both internal census records and Western accounts alike point to the indigence that marked Izmir's Jewish neighborhoods and the considerable number of beggars on their streets. By the late 19th century, the preponderance of Jewish beggars on Izmir's streets increasingly clashed with a growing discomfort with public displays of poverty in the modern city. Such discomfort was undergirded in Ottoman cities by the adoption of a European approach associating begging, especially on the part of those perceived to be able-bodied, with disorder, laziness, and sin. The Ottoman state itself implemented a range of policies reflecting this attitude, first banning begging in 1890, and then fully criminalizing it in 1909. Already by 1878, Izmir's Jewish community had established the Gabayei Tzedakah, the Stewards of Charity Society, with the express purpose of removing Jewish beggars from the streets. Its administrators ambitiously centralized the collection of all charity and distributed it in weekly installments called semanadas, only to those deemed officially worthy after an investigation into their circumstances. The early activities of the society are recorded in this Defter de Reclamos, this register, which is a veritable treasure trove for reconstructing how poverty was both lived and imagined in the Eastern Sephardi world. Despite the successes of Gabayei Tzedakah in concealing the community's poverty, Purim, with its raucous carnivals and public distribution of charity, unfailingly made it public. Of embarrassment, observers lamented how it allowed misery in all of its shapes and colors to take to the streets. Yet notably absent from any of the criticisms that surfaced every winter on the part of lay leaders, rabbis, and newspaper editors, and they're voluminous, is discomfort with the nature of Purim as a Jewish holiday. At no point do Izmir's Jewish leaders express any apprehension about putting their ethnic, religious, or cultural difference on display. As Izmirlis and as Jews in a plural Eastern Mediterranean city, they had undoubtedly seen their Christian neighbors do the same, be they pre-Lenten celebrations of the Greek Orthodox or Corpus Christi processions of local Latin Catholics. What preoccupied them was not Purim's public declaration of Jewish nationality, but its annual unveiling of the poverty it had worked so hard to hide. With its carnivals and begging processions, Purim put the community's diminished socioeconomic state on public display. In this little Paris of the Orient, this was a painful disjuncture they preferred to conceal. The remedies proffered to solve this problem reflect a second angle of the community's social transformations. To remedy the embarrassment of street carnivals and begging processions, communal notables promoted other, more dignified Purim rituals instead, particularly in the form of charity balls and theater performances. Increasingly commonplace in Izmir by the 1870s, such events became prominent around Purim, given the holiday's emphasis on caring for the needy. Referred to as balls, dancing soirees, and evening parties, these events were represented in the Ladino press as elegant and brilliant affairs. They were typically sponsored and attended by the upper echelons of the community, usually emanating from either the ranks of the communal leadership or Izmir's small number of Jewish mercantile elites. On the surface, these balls were held to raise funds for local charities, yet they operated on a symbolic level as well. In addition to the funds they raised, these events promoted a profound link between two cornerstones of bourgeois life, philanthropy and respectable leisure. A discourse emphasizing the harmony between these two values is evidenced in the earliest mentions of charity balls in Izmir's Ladino press. In advertising upcoming balls held by Izmir's Greek and Armenian communities in 1878, La Esperanza claimed that, quote, alongside entertainment, there must also be charity. In reporting on the multitude of charity balls that would become commonplace in the coming years, the paper would constantly laud those who made their attendance at such events un placer y un dover, a pleasure and a duty. Lending even more prestige to these events were the venues in which they were held. Traditionally, Jewish charitable activities were associated with communal facilities, such as the Haham Haneh, the office of the chief rabbinate. Yet Izmir's physical transformation over the course of the 19th century soon provided its Jewish community opulent new spaces for its charity events. The numerous public works projects undertaken expanding the port and rationalizing street layouts facilitated the construction of numerous clubs, hotels, theaters, and cafes. Among the most famous of these new venues was the Sporting Club, a grand waterfront building and attached theater built in 1893 that served as an exclusive gathering place for Izmir's mercantile elite and frequently hosted productions staged by European theater and opera companies. While Jews were not prominent amongst the club's membership, by the turn of the 20th century, Jewish charitable institutions had begun renting the venue for their own events. Most notable among these were the semi-annual theater and musical productions staged for the Ozer Dalim Society and the Talmud Torah School. Izmir's new Kramer Hotel in Paris, which this slide might be a little fuzzy on your end, I apologize, was called a splendid edifice that surpassed many great European hotels in luxury and elegance. And this also became a preferred venue for Jewish events. Notably, the Jewish elites attending such events were frequently joined by numerous Ottoman officials and local consuls. In 1883 ball celebrating the inauguration of a new Allianz building, for example, was attended by the local governor, officials from the army and the police force, the director of the Ottoman Bank, the director of the new Izmir Kasaba Railroad, the local Catholic archbishop, and the consuls of 10 countries. Interestingly, a special room had been prepared for the harem of the governor general of the province, who attended the party as his sons were students at the local Allianz school. Teaching and charity allowed upwardly mobile Jews in Izmir increased socialization with their non-Jewish neighbors. While Izmir's role as one of the empire's most active ports had always facilitated interaction between mercantile elites of different religious groups, the changing physical landscape of the city in the 19th century, along with the cultivation of Western social norms, gave rise to socialization beyond the world of commerce. Cinemas, clubs, theaters, and boat races are all known to have attracted mixed crowds. Given this changing environment, affluent Jews in Izmir saw increased socialization with their Greek, Muslim, and Armenian neighbors through their engagement in philanthropy. Among the numerous examples of such patterns is a 1907 benefit for the Talmud Torah. And the Talmud Torah was a school that educated and housed hundreds of impoverished children. The party was held at the exclusive sporting club, which you just saw, and the festive evening featured live music, theater, and poetry readings. Forming the honorary committee, and here's the invitation to the party, were the president of the municipality, the director of political affairs for the province, and the chief of police, along with a host of elites from Izmir's Greek, European, and Armenian communities. As for the performances, and here's the program for the party, Mademoiselle Cohen recited a poem by Victor Hugo, which was followed by a duet sung by two Greeks and a monologue recited by Mr. Spartali, an Armenian. Closing the entertainment was a duet performed by two women, one British and one Italian. Thus, a charity event for a Jewish school, a long-standing communal institution where nearly 500 destitute students were instructed in Jewish texts according to traditional methods, was attended by, in the words of the newspaper, the most refined enthusiasts of the Smyrniote public. Philanthropic endeavors such as the 1907 ball challenge our understanding of how Jews entered the middle class in the wider Jewish world. Long rooted in the Central and Western European experiences, scholarship on how Jews became bourgeois has emphasized the need for Jews to sideline or even abandon their religion and culture in order to become middle class. From Paris to Vienna to Berlin, scholars have shown how acculturation for aspiring bourgeois Jews was typically not accompanied by the integration it sought to facilitate. In England, for example, even baptized Jews associated closely with one another. The view from Ottoman Izmir suggests a stark and instructive contrast. Absent in the Islamic world was the demand that Jews modify or abandon their Jewishness. Western Jews ardently adopted middle-class values in service of demonstrating their fitness for citizenship, their worthiness of emancipation, their inclusion in the nation. Yet for Izmir's Jews, the process of becoming middle class was not born of such tensions. Unlike their Western co-religionists, who, in the words of one scholar, needed to be openly middle class but invisibly Jewish, for Izmir's Jews, making a monsieur out of one's son, which was what they called it all the time in the Ladino press, this process was fully compatible with one's Jewishness. We also find Izmir's Jews negotiating new constructions of class within the structure of the community itself, most notably with respect to taxation. A few words of background are in order here. Despite the gradual adoption of centralizing reforms in the 19th century, the empire's multiple religious groups continue to manage their internal affairs with little intervention from the state, maintaining their institutions, educating their children, tending to their poor, and managing their finances. Operating almost as a mini state, the Jewish Kehillah managed external taxes due to the Ottoman authorities, such as the jizya, the poll tax for non-Muslims, as well as internal taxes meant to sustain communal institutions. In Izmir, these expenses were covered by revenue generated from sales taxes on kosher goods, the idea being that the religious directive to consume kosher food would make taxes on kosher meat, but also occasionally wine and cheese, a dependable and constant stream of revenue. Known as gabela taxes, these levies were essentially regressive, burdening the poor consumer much more than his wealthier counterpart, and ultimately emerged as a source of relentless class conflict. Structural tensions were exacerbated by the competing interests of a broad range of stakeholders. These are just some of the people with a stake in how kosher meat was administered the shochatim, the slaughterers, the sellers of meat in the marketplace, the casapes. We have tax farmers, the gabeleros, who would purchase the tax outright and collect it later on. And then there are liaisons to the state. These are representatives that communicate the directives of the municipality regarding pricing and help move meat from the slaughterhouse to the marketplace. So the sheer multiplicity of stakeholders here makes the tax highly volatile, and attempts to reconcile conflicting demands frequently yielded contentious decisions. Now, this probably seems a little technical, but it's hard to overstate the absolute centrality of this tax to the Jewish community in Izmir, and this might not be clear on the surface. In the absence of other financial instruments, like income taxes based proportionally on wealth, for example, the meat gabela was the backbone of Izmir's communal budget. We see this in how various factions harnessed it over time. In 1888, for example, a group dissatisfied with communal oligarchs instituted an independent butchery system to, quote, ruin the gabela, arguing that such a strategy was the best way to force the hand of the communal council and the chief rabbi. Even the mere threat of external butcheries preoccupied communal leaders. Such was the case in 1897, when a group of Russian refugees arrived in town and sought their own building for prayer. The Sephardi communal council reacted with uneasiness, noting with fear the potential for them to eventually secure their own shochet. As La Buena Esperanza would put it, without the meat gabela, there would be no schools, no Talmud Torah, no hospital. The cemetery would turn into a pile of rocks. Another newspaper, El Pregonero, would put it this way: the rabbinate is meat, slaughterers, and butcher. In a word, cattle. When there is meat, there's community. As such, Jewish communal autonomy in Izmir lay not in the rabbinical courts, nor in the lay councils, but in the slaughterhouse. In the 19th century, Izmir's Jews began to engage this perennial source of class conflict in new ways. One increasingly common strategy was to shirk the tax entirely through the consumption of non-kosher meat. In 1882, for example, the communal council rejected a proposal to levy additional taxes on kosher meat to help cover the cost of absorbing Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in Russia. As the leadership noted, when there is a gabela, it is certain that our people will eat treif. In 1886, growing numbers of Jews were reportedly buying non-kosher meat rather than pay the inflated price of 9.25 kurush per oka, which was basically twice the price being charged in Izmir's other communities. 10 years later, some wondered whether the tax would even remain viable. Are we certain that only in a few years the consumption of kosher meat will be sufficient to maintain the most indispensable institutions of our community? In contrast to European Jewish communities, in Jewish Izmir, it wasn't ideology, but the havoc wrought by socioeconomic disparity that catalyzed the abandonment of Jewish tradition. The consumption of non-kosher meat wasn't the product of a critique regarding the compatibility of Jewish ritual with the modern world, nor a commentary on the relevance of continued rabbinic authority, but rather a product of deep-seated and polarizing class conflict. In contrast to Germany, for example, absent in the multi-ethnic Ottoman case was a Schachtfrage, literally the slaughter question, yielded by the perceived clash between Jewish ritual and the homogenizing framework of the nascent German nation state. In Izmir, it was actually the state that often intervened to protect and sustain the kosher slaughtering system, shielding it from abuse at the hands of self-interested butchers and even imprisoning shochatim who bypassed the communal council. The increasing consumption of non-kosher meat was accompanied by the emergence of an expanding range of tools for criticism of the tax, among them new bulletins, pamphlets, associations, even political parties. There's no better entry point into this Ladino public sphere than the bitter conflict over rabbinic secession that roiled the community between 1899 and 1901 that I opened with. When Chief Rabbi Avraham Palachi died in January of that year, after 30 years of leadership, conflict over the appointment of a successor ensued immediately. In the spring, a group supporting the candidacy of his son, Solomon, took the provocative step of bypassing the council and pronounced him chief rabbi. To solidify this move as a new reality, the group immediately sent its own shochatim to the slaughterhouse, instructing instructing them to begin slaughtering animals on behalf of the new administration with Palachi at its head. Leaving the communal council scrambling to enlist its own slaughterers, this move in effect left Izmir's Jews with two dueling administrations. The Palachi camp made the removal of the gabela its battle cry. As its head argued, what right do we have to crush the poor with taxes and force others to irreligion? In a community where direct personal taxes don't exist, the poorest among us have more of a right to control communal affairs. He later noted that the rich also had the resource of truffle-stuffed turkeys, which aren't subject to gabelas. Indeed, when the governor general of the province began to take an interest in this mini coup d'etat, asking for a list of plotters, the key figures emerged as a rag and bone man, a mender of sacks, 2 grocers, and 2 fruit sellers. While contention around the gabela was nothing new, by 1899, the two sides of the conflict thought of themselves not merely as factions, but as partidos, or parties, each with a platform on the gabela. Ultimately, these parties crystallized into 2 distinct camps, signified by the terms palachistas, those who campaigned to lift the gabela, and colelistas, those who sought to retain it. It was these party affiliations that dictated how Izmir's Jews engaged with the conflict, as they expressed their position as palachistas or colelistas through an expanding repertoire of behaviors. And here is an ad for a department store addressed to, colelistas and palachistas, telling them about a sale on linens. Elites expressed their positions through the communal administration, approving or denying subsidies to one faction or another. Yet a broader segment of Izmir's Jews found ways to express their loyalties as well. Given that Izmir was now home to 2 administrations, each with its own staff of ritual slaughterers, the purchase of meat from one party over the other evolved into a mechanism of modern political expression. As El Meseret noted, until now in the city, there had been 2 Jewish rites, Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Now there are 3. The paper recounts numerous anecdotes testifying to the deep meaning encoded in consuming meat slaughtered by one faction or the other, expressed by families around the dinner table, siblings playing in the street, and consumers in the marketplace. Such debate was still present a year later, when hundreds of people signed a letter sent to the chief rabbi of the empire, decrying how many people had boycotted kosher meat entirely to avoid supporting the Palachista party. Jewish Izmirlis also began to express their loyalties through signing petitions. The Ladino press describes a sort of petition fever, with numerous petitions circulating and reportedly monopolizing all conversation. Poking fun at its readers' rush to sign petitions, but still reflecting the deep meaning encoded in the act, El Meseret advised its leaders to sign each petition multiple times, arguing that way you'll be the most correct, the most passionate, the most impartial, just, conscientious, civilized, educated, and enlightened. Similar to Izmir's aspiring bourgeois, tracking the discourses and practices around the gabela demonstrates not only the simultaneous existence of both Ottoman and Jewish spheres, but their overlapping and even mutually reinforcing nature. Take, for example, a Ladino pamphlet entitled Shavat Aniyim. It's a Ladino pamphlet with a Hebrew title, which means the cry of the poor. Published anonymously in 1847 on behalf of El Pueblo, the people, Shavat Aniyim charges the communal leadership with dishonor and abuse, oppression and humiliation. The pamphlet further condemns the oligarchs for, quote, treating the poor as slaves, taking no pity on them, and abusing them much more than we were abused during our enslavement in Egypt. The pamphlet also claims that Izmir's Jewish poor were, quote, more coerced than the Anusim of Spain, or those who suffered forcible baptism during the age of the Inquisition, obviously. The pamphlet enumerates the different strategies Izmir's Jewish poor had tried to combat the gabela, boycott, secession, even apostasy, all to no avail. In Shavat Aniyim's retelling, redemption would only come from an external source, the Tanzimat, a sweeping set of changes that, among many other things, promised to reassert the authority of a newly centralized state over the ruling establishment of the empire's numerous semi-autonomous ethno-religious groups. The people have the freedom of our Lord King Sultan Abdul Majid, who ordered that with the beneficial reforms, all of his flock is liberated and free, declared the pamphlet. don't force us to be slaves to people we have no obligation to serve. Now empowered by the Tanzimat to liberate themselves from communal oligarchs, Shavatanim expressed relief that Izmir's Jewish poor could rightfully be subject to the law of Moses. Seen through the eyes of Izmir's Jewish poor, it was thus the Ottoman Sultan who was the ultimate protector of Jewish law, wresting it from the corruption of the Kehillah. The mutually reinforcing nature of these discourses became only more amplified over time. In the wake of the Young Turk Revolution in 1909, the satirical El Soitari published the Agada de la Carne, the meat Haggadah. Using the template of the traditional Passover Haggadah, El Soitari recast the biblical narrative of the Israelites' oppression, enslavement, and ultimate liberation as the ongoing struggle for freedom from the injustices of Izmir's kosher meat industry. For example, where the original text reads, "We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim," El Soitari's version reads, "We were slaves to the butcher in Izmir, siervos fuimos al kasap Izmir." The text goes on, framing the kosher meat industry as enslavement wrought by Izmir slaughterers and butchers, and celebrating the Constitution of 1908 as the liberator. Again, using the traditional text as a model, the Haggadah states, "If there had been no constitution in Turkey, we, our children, and our children's children would still be enslaved, powerless to free ourselves." And it celebrates how it was the Constitution that took us out of slavery, not by the hands of the shaliach or the messenger, and not by the hands of unknown people, but by none other than Niazi and Anver. The case of Ottoman Izmir invites us to consider the many insights to be gained by not only including Sephardi Jewry in larger narratives, but in using their experience to rethink our read of the wider Jewish encounter with modernity. The modern age, as Izmir's Jews understood it, demanded that they reconsider not their relationship to Judaism, but to poverty, its public visibility, its causes, its remedies, even its very legitimacy. Thus, the festival of Purim preoccupied them not because of how it declared Jewish nationality, but because of how it unveiled the poverty they had sought to remove from view. The ever-escalating attention directed at the kosher meat industry was rooted in controversy not over Jewish ritual as a marker of difference, but rather the reconfiguration of a traditional system that might be sensitive to the cry of the poor. These examples, among many others, reflect that the challenge as they understood it was not how to minimize their religious distinctiveness or harmonize it with that of a majority, but how to harness it in service of new social hierarchies. Moreover, while I didn't have time to talk about this here, I'd like to add that the interpretive gains of prioritizing socioeconomic class can open new vistas, not only in the study of Sephardi Jewry, but in the study of the Ottoman Empire more broadly. Socioeconomic class has the potential to illuminate important parallels between the experiences of Jews and their Muslim neighbors that are obscured by the often uninterrogated social taxonomy of Muslim versus Dhimmi or Muslim versus ex-Dhimmi. It also productively unsettles the category of Ottoman non-Muslim, which is a term that's typically used as a shorthand for the empire's commercial bourgeoisie. Moreover, a focus on social class and the spheres in which it is most visible, such as work, the family, the neighborhood, the street. It provides much needed tools with which to test, refine, and reappraise categories that are so often taken for granted, like coexistence. The approach I take in my book suggests that it's not only possible, but perhaps very likely that the vision of progress held by a Jewish dock worker in Izmir was much more similar to that of his Muslim fellow Hamal than to that of a Greek or Armenian merchant on Frank Street. Ultimately, my book strives to tell the story of a neglected community, and through that story to enrich our understanding of both Ottoman and Jewish modernity and the place of the Sephardi world within it. I hope not only to have claimed a voice for Izmir's Jews and the world they inhabited, but to argue that their experiences as beggars and rabbis, housewives and peddlers is of profound historical significance. So with that, I will stop and stop sharing as well. And okay.
Wonderful. So we actually have a few questions already that have started, but I will make a few comments just to open up and to kind of raise the issues that I took out of this. But I want to start by saying that, oops, are you hearing me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, good. I want to start by saying that, you know, this book is a really kind of in-depth look into a particular moment of Sephardi Jewry in Izmir and also in the Ottoman Empire as a case study that lends itself, in fact, to multiple. I could come up with multiple ways of going from this case study to comparing, to thinking more generally, more theoretically about the processes that you're talking about. And it's so fruitful to have all of this detail to open our eyes and then to think more broadly from the text that you gave us. So I want to do that. I want to raise a few comparisons. I want to raise a few kind of issues that I came up with and thought about. And somebody who has actually spent most of my career working on issues of difference and coexistence and all of that, and started in the Ottoman Empire and then expanded from there, one of the things that really strikes me in this case is that the particular structural and cultural arrangements that the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman rulers shaped early on when they made arrangements with the different religious groups really had an impact for this moment and for this community in ways that we have to highlight, in ways that we have to differentiate from other cases. And what I mean by that is, in the Millet system, in the state religious community relationships as they were established and as they evolved over time, we see the degree to which the Ottoman context was important here. Uh, the, the Jewish community had this particular trajectory.
Of refugees.
Excuse me? Okay, the Jewish community had this particular trajectory partly because of the space that was created by a tolerant Ottoman administration, a tolerant understanding of relations with different communities. It's the live and let live a little bit. It's the ability for communities to have their autonomy, to have their way of life, but also in many ways, it also shapes a little bit this concern with, the poverty, what you bring that is so interesting. They're not concerned about showing their Jewishness, which in Europe would be such an issue. But here they're concerned about showing their poverty, and that poverty and showing that has a lot to do also with the way the Ottomans organized religious groups, the taxation, the ability to how do you say it, for communities to produce wealth. This was really important for the Ottomans. So not showing poverty, controlling poverty, all of that was also part of the way in which community leaders needed to control their people so that the state didn't interfere. So that was very interesting too. It's partly toleration, partly social control. All throughout Ottoman state Jewish relations or state Christian relations, what you see is the leadership trying to maintain boundaries. They're not worried about religion as much as they're worried about people who will exit the boundary, people who will commit crimes, keep people who will, so that's very interesting. And it is that context that makes your book even more interesting, because you're telling this story of that space within which there was the ability for the leadership and the lower classes to forge their own way and to figure out their own trajectories. So that's really interesting to me, and I want to highlight that in your book. Do you see? So that's one issue. Then the other part of the book that is really fascinating, and you don't label it as such, and I wish you, or maybe I missed it, this is modernization for a community becoming modern in empire. It's really a different mode of becoming modern than becoming modern in a nation state. So that contrast is so important, because in fact, if you look at Devin Nar's book on Salonika, his is about becoming modern in already the Greek nation state. Mm-hmm. All the forces of homogeneity and, all of that working to shape the Jewish community, and the Jewish community, trying to negotiate all of that. So you have two models of becoming modern. And I want you, if you want to in this conversation, to think through of what modernity means in each model, because they're different. And modernity for you is so much more, there isn't the threat of secularization yet. But if you read, for example, Sinem Adar's book on Jews in Alexandria and in Istanbul, the comparative on post-Ottoman, Alexandria and Istanbul, you see the degree to which that has changed. And it changes for Izmir too, because once the nation state is, the Turkish nation state is so powerfully nationalist, Jews have to deal with this. So you're talking about temporally, spatially, and, kind of interactively a protected moment and space. And modernity is different there. And I want to also raise the point that modernity at that time was actually more than the parties, how do you call them, the charity events and all of that, where there was coexistence or mixing of populations, the Muslims who came, at least the high level officials, but also Greeks, etc. There is a modernity that comes out in that moment, and I think in that space, out of imitating, the Karaosmanoğlu's, for example, the brokers of that time imitated the Europeans and built, European roads and bridges and this and that, and invested in community. The Greeks imitated the Karaosmanoğlu's. There was actually a process of interaction between these groups that was also partly modernizing. And again, it was different than the nation state, because it was more more network. By the time you come to the nation state, each community is struggling on its own to both modernize, secularize, respond to states that are imposing their rules on them. You see, so I think that is really special to the Ottoman modernization too, and would be nice to further look at. And then I was gonna say, you know, I think of the Alliance, and maybe that's because I have this parental background in the Alliance. I think of the Alliance as a very much involved in the debates of the Enlightenment, at least in Istanbul, or in, you know, they're teaching the texts of the Enlightenment, they're talking about the Enlightenment. And I was wondering if you found that in your analysis too, and if it had an impact on the Jews of Izmir and how it had an impact. And finally, I'm gonna raise one more issue, and I think it's another way of looking at the comparison is looking at the Jewish experience in the non-Western world by looking at Izmir, Istanbul, Salonika, Edirne, you know, all of these cities of the Eastern Mediterranean that actually had two moments, an Ottoman moment and a post-Ottoman Greek, Turkish, or even if you look in the Arab world, had a different trajectory. And I'm thinking that you again opened up for us possibilities for future students of ours to do this kind of comparative work that is so useful. So I commend you for it, and I think it's a marvelous piece of work. So if you want to answer some of the questions or issues, I'm open. If not, I can ask you some of the questions that came up. Hello, I think can you hear me, Dina? Hello?
Dina? No.
Can you hear me?
What happened to Dina?
Frozen.
We are
Frozen. It's frozen.
Frozen.
She's going
She's
back
gonna,
on. Going back
yeah,
on.
she'll log in.
Go back
Good.
on.
Yeah, she's coming back now. Good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Can't see you, but we can hear you.
We
Where are you?
can't see you though.
I'll find her.
Oh, you can?
We'll find you. You keep talking.
You can talk.
Okay. My camera is on, so I'm not sure.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
There, you're here.
Okay. Okay. All right. I'll thank you for your response, and I'd love to talk more about some of the issues that you raised, and then if there's time, we can go to the questions that are submitted from in the chat. But yeah, I think that is your point about how the imperial setting creates a particular space for these types of transformations to happen. And I think that's exactly, that's what I'm trying to draw out. And I'd say that even it's certainly productive to think in terms of, nation state versus empire. And there, those are, as you've written, you yourself lay this out so clearly in the scholarship that, there's just a different mode, a different way the Ottomans had of coping with difference. Like there's a different logic to it, right? It's not the homogenizing coerciveness that you find in the setup of a nation state. So that is one of the conditions that allows for the possibility of these types of changes. But I think it's even beyond empire versus nation state, because in trying to think comparatively, when I was trying to situate this case study in the larger arc of Jewish history, right? We have many other cases where Jews are living in empires, right? But there's still very heavy coercion, like in in the Russian context, for example. And so I think that I think makes what the Ottoman case kind of unique, in that, yes, there's the imperial logic and not the logic of the nation state, right? But absent is the Judeophobia that that exists in the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? We're also missing that violent anti-Semitism now. And I'm not at all trying to suggest that the Ottoman space is this like glorious interfaith utopia where there's no issues and no skirmishes, and there's plenty of transgressing of boundaries and people being brought in line, certainly. But so I think, yes, and that's part of what I'd like to be able to show through this case study is that a lot of the categories, a lot of the metrics that we use for studying Jewish history, really, they're not suited well to the Sephardi world, right? And we're so many, like you mentioned Salonika, right? And as you highlighted, right, that's already for me, that's like in the Western nation state, model. It's more productive to think along those lines, post-imperial kind of majority, minority, the processes of Hellenization, et cetera. And I sort of came to the archival material expecting some kind of anxiety about Jewishness, only because I had done all this reading in modern Jewish history and just took that for granted, like, oh, there has to be some kind of problem. Because there always is. But when you look at, when I started trying to piece together these dynamics and realize, like, why are they so worried about this? They never mention the fact that it's a Jewish holiday. There's no anxiety about that. So what I think, what I hope that we can, derive from studying the Sephardi world in detail is, asking different questions and hopefully, elaborating newer paradigms, like to focus on social class, for example. I don't want to flatten the Islamic world into one, into one kind of undifferentiated category. But when you look, for example, at the Jews of Baghdad, right, there's a lot, where the socioeconomic makeup is different, but there's still, there's still this motif of class conflict, right? I think there are cases of this in North Africa too. So I think that, if we can bracket some of the paradigms that we've inherited from the more standard Jewish studies and try to, develop new ones for looking at Jews in the Islamic world, I think it would be more productive than instead of looking for, oh, this looks like it might be, some kind of acculturation or some kind of integration, right? So that's hopefully what I hope the case study, what people can derive from, aside from, I think, the benefit of talking about people that have gone almost completely neglected. I mean, the Jews of Izmir, like they surface in the secondary literature. Basically, it's kind of a site of infamy, right? It's the hometown of Shabtai Tzvi, the failed Messiah, and then it like disappears off the map until I don't know when, really. I mean, it doesn't really get a lot of attention. So that was another goal of mine, was to make this, to privilege this community as the place where the whole narrative, not just like, showing up as a problem here, a problem there, like a synthetic kind of story for this place. In terms of the discourse of the Enlightenment, I think that you mentioned with the Alliance schools, that certainly plays a part in how the community is rethinking its attitude to poverty, right? They're borrowing from the Haskalah, right? This like impulse towards productivizing Jews and making them useful, right? And they sort of, the Alliance brings that in a nice like Jewish package for the communities. And there's even a sense in Izmir that, I don't know, they have a sense that Jews in Izmir are even more backward than other places in the Orient. Like they're the most Oriental out of the Orientals. They're more lazy, that like the Jews of Salonika are more industrious than the Jews of Izmir. So, there we have there is that like Maskilic discourse of productivizing Jews, and then it's infused with that like kind of Orientalist discourse about, poverty is not just, Jews don't only need to be productivized, but, their poverty is also, it's a product of their Oriental nature, right? And if they could just improve themselves and, and engage in this process of regeneration. So there's certainly the discourse of the Haskalah and the Enlightenment, the alliances, it makes a lot of inroads in Izmir, for sure. There's multiple schools that are established.
I think
so
questions, Dina, if
yeah,
if you
sure.
answering questions, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I can.
Okay, so I'll start with John's question. He says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. My question is as follows. What made you choose Izmir to study? Is there something about the social and cultural makeup of Izmir or its Jews that is determinative of your story, or could something similar have played out elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire? Or is it that the source base for Izmir is more both rich and accessible?
Okay, it's definitely more rich. It's not more accessible, but I can say more. I could say more about all those things. So Karen, like you, I have roots in Izmir. It's the home of both my paternal grandparents were born in Ottoman Izmir. So I grew up with a sense of the place. I mean, I inherited a kind of nostalgia for a place that I'd never been there until I started doing research. But in general, I'd say I was interested in class conflict, and Izmir just to the extent that it does surface in the sources, it always surfaces in the context of some kind of fight, of some kind of class, some kind of moment of strife. So that made me curious about what are the particular dynamics, and I'd say that we are lucky in the case of Izmir in that there's a really robust archive, like unlike the communal archive of Salonika, which is lost to us, unlike the archive of Istanbul, which is not readily accessible. There is a robust archive from the community that I think was taken illegally out of Turkey in the 70s and deposited in an Israeli archive where I did most of my research. And the sources go back to 1760 and go until 1970. So it's robust, but the reason I say it's not particularly accessible is that it relies and uses a script that's specific to the Eastern Sephardi diaspora, solitreo, the sort of cursive that's specific to the Sephardi world. So the paleography is challenging. But once I decided to, learn the paleography, I became very, very eager to use it. So those are the particular factors that drew me to this community in general.
Okay. There is another question on the interconnection between the situation of the Jews of Izmir and the Dönme. And then Ethan Katz wants to ask questions, but he didn't write them. So we have to give him we have to unmute him. So if you want to respond first to the relationship between the Jews
Dönme
and the Dönme. Yeah.
I don't want to say that it's non-existent in Izmir, but it's certainly not as pronounced as it was in Salonika, for example. So I haven't. First of all, the Dönme are sort of notoriously hard to study because it's a secret. It's a tradition based on oral histories, and it's very hard to document. So it's not particularly pronounced in Izmir the way it was in Salonika, to my knowledge. But Izmir, of course, was a seat of messianic fervor in the early modern period, but less so in the late Ottoman. And are we unmuting Ethan or?
No, he has a question now. He says, thanks for a great talk, Dina. How would you situate your argument vis-a-vis the recent work of scholars like Julia Philippe-Cohen and Michel Campos on Jews and Ottomanism? Is this class dynamic and visible Jewishness a particular version of Ottomanism that we have not yet been attuned to by this scholarship? Or is this something different that throws into question the paradigm of Jews focusing so much on Ottomanism, which to my reading implies a greater degree of conformity than your story tells?
I thank you. I can't see you, Ethan, but thank you for the question. And I think that's a good question. And I'm not sure that, I don't mean to sort of diminish, like, okay, Jews in the Ottoman Empire had no pressures at all, to adopt, certain, like the Ottomanism that you bring up, for example. There were certain pressures to become an Ottoman, right? And to adopt that kind of civic Ottomanism that people have talked about, that Julia's talked about, that Michelle Campos has talked about. But, all of that, I don't see that as destabilizing or disrupting Jewishness in a way that we would understand to be, more prevalent in a nation state framework. But I will say in general, and I think that this is true for Ottoman studies on the whole, is that we've privileged so much the state perspective, and the class dynamic, the sort of street level sources, like I think that it could stand to be a lot more developed. This is like the direction my research is going, is looking, the marriage marketplace, guild agreements, because I think that we might be privileging too much these larger political processes of transformation and perhaps leaving a lot of these other processes uninterrogated, or just, as a part of the landscape that is not particularly worth exploring. So I don't really see them in conflict, but I think, the more, if we could switch the optics a little bit and focus more on class dynamics, which I know is happening in the study of Izmir's Muslims, for example, right? Because the literature has so much privilege, this idea of the Petit Paris and cosmopolitanism and becoming bourgeois, right? You almost don't hear about Muslims in Izmir, who actually form a pretty significant number, but they fall through the cracks just like the Jews, because they don't fit into that narrative of cosmopolitan Smyrna. The same is true for places like Alexandria, right? That whole Eastern Mediterranean orbit suffers from that, I'd say too much attention, or the kind of overemphasizing of a cosmopolitanism that tends to leave out the people who are impoverished, who are the majority. Should I look?
Good. Can you amplify what were the problems facing the kosher meat market? Why nothing done to keep it alive? Did I miss something? Michael Semler. I'm not sure.
Nothing done to keep it going. The kosher meat tax. I have found sources into the 1930s, into the Republican period, where the community is still grappling with how to generate revenue. And they're still talking about levying a sales tax on kosher meat to sustain communities. So it's something that I think ultimately fizzles away, but it certainly lasts throughout the late imperial, the late Ottoman Empire is still there. They're still talking about it in the 1930s. So,
yeah. Marilyn Siegel says, if there is time, can you or Dina at least briefly let us know about the Jewish community in Izmir, if it still exists in Turkey, particularly after the recent political changes? When were you there last, Dina? Can you tell us a bit? Hello? I think we lost her again.
Yeah, well, I was there. I was there doing, I was actually studying Turkish at Boğaziçi University, and I went to Izmir to start poking around for sources. And I learned that most of them had been taken out and brought to Israel. But there, to my knowledge, the number that I've heard thrown around is about 2,000 Jews left in Izmir. I've heard the number 20,000 Jews left in Turkey. I don't think anyone's checked that number recently. I mean, it's a number that's been thrown around for a long time. But 2,000 Jews approximately in Izmir, but there's a lot of there are a lot of new initiatives on the ground to preserve what's left of Izmir's Jewish institutions. I know there were efforts underway to get there's a very high density of synagogues in the Old Jewish Quarter. And so there were efforts underway to get those designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You know, there are efforts on the ground to preserve the Jewish heritage of the city, but the community. I mean, at its height, when the period I was talking about, there were about 25,000 Jews in Izmir, which is about 10% of the city's population, and it's a teeny tiny fraction of what it was.
Let me see. I think we're coming to the end of our questions too. Let me see. Sarah Levin on this question of modernity in Islamic world versus Europe, a great article. Oh, this is not a question. This is just an article for us to read. That's great. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
We'll look at it. I think there is also a question on convivencia, Lynn Gottlieb, and that will be our last question. Thank you for this important lecture about the Sephardic community. Would you say that the spirit of convivencia frames Sephardic Jewish relations with non-Jews?
I'd say, I mean, the convivencia is actually a paradigm that was invented by German scholars about the medieval period. So I'd say that I'm not sure it ever really, I'm not sure it's ever particularly useful as a paradigm. And I'd say in general, it's hard to, this is, I think, a larger challenge. And here I'm following what I've heard Aaron talk about, is our need to really refine vocabulary in talking about these communities, because that's always tossed around with the Sephardi world, convivencia, like tolerance in the Ottoman Empire. And it's for us to really, I don't know, concretize what that actually means, and what those types of interactions were like on a day-to-day basis. So something I'm involved in now, I in my work on dowries, I've discovered copied in the back of a defter someone's inheritance. Like this storekeeper died, and then his estate was settled over the course of 10 years. And I've gone through to kind of concretize, okay, all right, we're talking about coexistence, right? How many of his creditors were Muslims? How many of them were Christians? And I love social history, so this is kind of my bread and butter, is these kind of big Excel spreadsheets, trying to concretize what are the boundaries of that coexistence, right? Where do people work together? Where is that difference signaled? Where is it bracketed? So I think in general, I try not to think in terms of convivencia. I don't think, especially for the Ottoman, the Ottoman case studies that I'm most interested in, it doesn't have a lot of explanatory utility.
Dina, thank you so much. Actually, this was a nice way to end as well. And you are right that we need to think more in terms of the empirical material and what the empirical material tells us about how people lived and how they really interacted, and what were the spaces of interaction. And as long as we can do that, I think we'll over time figure out a new vocabulary for it as well, because you're right to say that convivencia is not adequate for this, and it also has a very romantic side to it. So, but I'm told that we need to end, And for you on the East Coast, it's really late now. So we really thank you. This was so wonderful. And I'm so happy to have met you through Zoom. And I look forward to more interactions. And I look forward to dowries and marriage markets and maybe some gossip too about our communities. So
Oh, always plenty. Always plenty of gossip.
Let's do that. Thank you everyone for attending and asking questions, and a big attendance. We really are grateful. Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dina.